Stop everything you're doing right now. I'm about to tell you something that will completely flip your understanding of one of the most misused words in the English language. Ready? The greatest rebels in human history were called dogs, and they were proud of it. You see that person over there? The one rolling their eyes at the news, muttering, "Politicians are all the same." We call them cynical. That friend who says love never lasts after another celebrity divorce, cynical. That co-worker who thinks every company promise is just corporate BS, definitely cynical. But here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. True cynics weren't bitter, defeated, or hopeless. They were the most fearlessly optimistic people who ever lived. 2,400 years ago, in the bustling streets of ancient Athens, there lived a man who owned absolutely nothing. Not a house, not money, not even a bowl to eat from. He threw it away after seeing a child drink from cupped hands. His name was Diogenes, and he lived in a barrel. People thought he was insane. Alexander the Great, you know, the guy who conquered most of the known world, once found Diogenes lounging in the sunshine. "I am Alexander the Great," he announced. "Ask me for anything you desire." Diogenes looked up lazily and said, "Yeah, could you move? You're blocking my sun." That's right. The most powerful man on earth was told to get lost by a homeless guy in a barrel. And here's the crazy part. Alexander was so impressed he said, "If I were not Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes." But Diogenes wasn't just some eccentric street performer. He was launching a philosophical revolution that would spread across the ancient world and secretly shape everything you believe about freedom, happiness, and what it means to be human. The word cynic comes from the Greek word kynikos, meaning dog-like. And Diogenes, he absolutely loved being called a dog. Because dogs, he said, were the wisest creatures on earth. They were loyal without being servile, honest without being cruel, content without being lazy. They lived in the moment, loved unconditionally, and never pretended to be something they weren't. Everything humans had forgotten how to do. So how did a philosophy about living authentically, rejecting materialism and fearlessly speaking truth to power become associated with bitterness and defeat? How did the word that once described history's most liberated people become what we use to describe the most spiritually imprisoned? And why does this ancient story matter so much right now, in our age of social media, endless consumption, and carefully curated fake lives? What you're about to discover will change how you see everything. That homeless person on the street corner? Maybe they know something about freedom that you don't. That friend who quit their high-paying job to teach kids? They might be channeling ancient wisdom without knowing it. That voice in your head that sometimes whispers, "There has to be more to life than this." That's not cynicism. That's your inner cynic trying to break free. This is the story of the most radical idea in human history, that you don't have to live the way other people expect you to live. It's the story of how a philosophy of absolute freedom got twisted into an attitude of absolute defeat. And it's the story of how understanding the difference might just be the key to reclaiming your own life. So forget everything you think you know about cynicism, because we're about to meet the real cynics. The ancient rebels who chose to live like free people in an unfree world, like honest people in a dishonest system, like hopeful people in a hope-starved culture. They didn't do it because it was easy. They did it because someone had to show the rest of us what authentic human life actually looks like. Are you ready to meet the most misunderstood revolutionaries in history? Are you ready to discover what cynicism really means? Are you ready to find out what happens when you stop caring what other people think and start caring about what actually matters? Because here's what Diogenes understood that we've forgotten. The person who needs the least has the most. The person who fears nothing can do anything. And the person brave enough to live authentically changes everything. Welcome to the real story of the Cynics. Your life may never be the same. Chapter 1. The Dog Philosopher. You're walking through the bustling agora of ancient Athens, the heart of civilization's greatest city. Merchants hawk their wares, politicians debate policy, and philosophers gather students around marble columns. Then you notice something that stops you cold. A nearly naked man, weathered and wild-haired, living in what appears to be a large ceramic storage jar. Passers-by either laugh, sneer, or hurry past in embarrassment. But here's what they don't realize. This homeless vagrant is about to become one of history's most influential philosophers, and his radical ideas will echo through the centuries long after the marble statues of kings have crumbled to dust. This is Diogenes of Sinope, and everything you think you know about cynicism starts with understanding why this brilliant man chose to live like what the Greeks called him, a dog. But to grasp the revolutionary nature of what he was doing, we need to understand that in 4th century Athens, this wasn't madness. It was the most sophisticated act of rebellion the ancient world had ever seen. Diogenes wasn't born in the streets. He came from Cynope, a prosperous trading city on the Black Sea, where his father was a banker, a man of considerable wealth and social standing. Imagine growing up in comfort, with every expectation of inheriting a respectable position in society. But sometimes, seeing the world up close can shatter our illusions about it entirely. The turning point came when Diogenes witnessed his father's involvement in a currency debasement scandal. Now you might think this would simply make him angry at his particular father, but Diogenes saw something far more profound at work. He realized that the corruption wasn't an exception to how society operated. It was how society operated. The wealth, the status, the respectability his family enjoyed all rested on a foundation of deception and exploitation. But here's where Diogenes did something that separates true philosophers from mere critics. Instead of writing angry letters or seeking reform, he performed what we might call the most dramatic philosophical experiment in history. He gave away everything he owned, not to charity, not to family, but simply discarded it all as if it were garbage, because in his mind, that's exactly what it was. Think about what this means for a moment. We live in a world where losing a job or a relationship can feel like the end of everything. Diogenes voluntarily threw away an entire life of privilege and security to test a simple but radical hypothesis, that human happiness and freedom don't come from having more, but from needing less. He wasn't trying to punish himself or make a political statement. He was conducting the ultimate experiment in human liberation. The results of this experiment would prove more shocking than anyone could have imagined. When Diogenes stripped away all his possessions instead of finding misery, he discovered something extraordinary, a kind of freedom that his wealthy contemporaries couldn't even comprehend. He could say anything to anyone, go anywhere he pleased, and live entirely according to his own principles, because he had nothing left to lose. In a society built on fear of losing status, wealth, or reputation, Diogenes had made himself invulnerable by having none of these things to begin with. But this was only the beginning of his philosophical revolution. Having discovered the intoxicating power of absolute freedom, Diogenes was about to take his experiment even further, in ways that would scandalize Athens and earn him a nickname that was meant as an insult, but which he would wear as a badge of honor. Now, when the Athenians called Diogenes a dog, they weren't being playful. In ancient Greek culture, calling someone a dog was one of the worst insults imaginable. It suggested someone who was shameless, crude, and lacking in basic human dignity. But Diogenes heard this insult and had what we might call a philosophical epiphany. He looked at actual dogs and realized the Greeks had accidentally identified the perfect model for human happiness. Consider what Diogenes observed about dogs. They're completely honest. A dog can't pretend to like you for social advantage. They live entirely in the present moment, feeling joy without worrying about tomorrow's troubles. They're loyal to those who treat them well and utterly indifferent to social status. A dog doesn't care if you're a king or a beggar. Most importantly, they satisfy their needs simply and directly, without the elaborate rituals and artificial complications that humans create around basic activities like eating, sleeping, or mating. This observation led Diogenes to one of philosophy's most radical conclusions, that civilization, with all its rules and conventions, doesn't make us more human, it makes us less human. We become so tangled up in artificial social requirements that we lose touch with our natural selves. A dog knows exactly what it needs and goes about getting it in the most direct way possible. Humans, by contrast, create elaborate systems of shame, status, and social performance that make us miserable even when our basic needs are met. So Diogenes began living according to what he called the dog's philosophy. He ate when he was hungry, wherever he happened to be, without worrying about table manners or appropriate dining times. He slept wherever he found himself tired, without concerning himself with proper bedrooms or social arrangements. He spoke the truth as he saw it, regardless of whether it offended powerful people. He satisfied his sexual needs naturally and openly, believing that hiding these basic human functions behind closed doors was itself a form of dishonesty. To the sophisticated Athenians, this behavior was outrageous. But Diogenes had calculated correctly that their outrage revealed more about them than about him. When people were scandalized by his public urination, he would ask why it was acceptable to satisfy hunger in public by eating, but not acceptable to satisfy other natural needs in the same way. When they criticized his crude behavior, he would point out that their refined behavior often masked much cruder motivations: greed, vanity, and the desire to dominate others. The genius of Diogenes' approach was that he forced people to examine the arbitrary nature of their social conventions. Why is this behavior acceptable but that behavior shameful? Who decided these rules, and what purpose do they really serve? By living like a dog, Diogenes was actually asking the most sophisticated philosophical questions imaginable about the nature of human society and the sources of human happiness. But calling himself a dog was more than just social criticism. Diogenes was developing a comprehensive philosophy that would challenge every assumption his contemporaries held about the good life, and his insights would prove to be far more systematic and profound than his outrageous behavior might suggest. Here's what most people missed about Diogenes, and what many people still miss today. Beneath all the shocking behavior and outrageous stunts was one of the most rigorous philosophical minds of the ancient world. Diogenes wasn't crazy, and he wasn't just trying to provoke people for the sake of provocation. He was testing fundamental assumptions about human nature through the most direct method possible: lived experience. His core insight can be summarized in a simple but revolutionary principle. The things we think we need for happiness are usually the very things that make happiness impossible. Consider how this works in practice. We believe we need wealth to be secure, but the pursuit and maintenance of wealth often creates more anxiety than poverty ever could. We think we need social approval to feel worthy, but the constant effort to manage our reputation makes authentic relationships nearly impossible. We assume we need comfort and convenience to be happy, but Diogenes discovered that the more comfortable we become, the more uncomfortable we are with any disruption to that comfort. This led him to develop what we might call the paradox of freedom. The more we try to control our external circumstances to make ourselves happy, the more enslaved we become to those circumstances. The person with 1,000 possessions has 1,000 things to worry about. The person with no possessions has nothing to lose and therefore nothing to fear. But Diogenes took this insight even deeper. He realized that most human suffering comes not from failing to get what we want, but from wanting things in the first place. This wasn't a message of despair, quite the opposite. If our desires are the source of our unhappiness, then the solution isn't to fulfill all our desires, which is impossible, but to examine which desires are really necessary and which are artificial constructions created by society. This is why his encounters with Alexander the Great were so philosophically significant. When the most powerful man in the world offered to grant Diogenes any wish, the philosopher's response, "Stand out of my sunlight," wasn't just a clever comeback. It was a precise demonstration of his entire philosophy. Here was a man who had conquered most of the known world, who could offer unlimited wealth, power, and luxury. And Diogenes identified the one thing he actually wanted, that Alexander was preventing him from having: simple access to natural warmth and light. The story reveals something profound about both men. Alexander, despite all his power, couldn't give himself the kind of contentment that Diogenes had found through philosophy. And Diogenes, despite having nothing by conventional standards, possessed something that even the greatest conqueror in history envied: genuine independence and peace of mind. This wasn't just abstract philosophy for Diogenes. He had discovered practical techniques for human flourishing that were so effective they would survive for centuries and influence everyone from Roman emperors to Christian monks. His method was simple but demanding. Systematically eliminate everything in your life that doesn't contribute to genuine happiness, regardless of what society tells you is important. The result, he claimed, was a kind of freedom that most people can't even imagine, because they've never experienced life without the constant anxiety of protecting their possessions, reputation, and social position. As word of Diogenes' philosophy spread throughout the Greek world, something remarkable began to happen. Despite the shocking nature of his lifestyle, or perhaps because of it, people from all walks of life began to seek him out, not as a curiosity, but as a teacher. Wealthy merchants abandoned their businesses to study with him. Aristocrats gave away their inheritances to live according to his principles. Even women, who had virtually no philosophical rights in ancient Greece, began adopting Cynic practices and ideas. But the most significant development was yet to come. Diogenes' radical experiment in human freedom was about to spawn an entire philosophical movement that would spread across the ancient world, adapting his core insights to different cultures and circumstances while maintaining his essential challenge to conventional society. The homeless dog philosopher had lit a fire that would burn for centuries, and its influence would reach far beyond anything he could have imagined during those nights sleeping under the stars in ancient Athens. Diogenes died as he had lived, on his own terms, free from the fears and anxieties that plagued even the most powerful people of his time. Legend says that when asked how he wanted to be buried, he replied that he should simply be thrown over the city wall for the animals to eat, since his body would be as worthless in death as his possessions had been in life. But while Diogenes may have considered his physical form disposable, the ideas he had lived and taught were about to prove remarkably durable. Because here's what the old dog philosopher couldn't have foreseen: his radical experiment in individual freedom would soon attract followers who would transform his personal rebellion into a systematic philosophy. These disciples would take his insights about human nature and social convention and develop them into a comprehensive worldview that would challenge the greatest empires of the ancient world. They would prove that the principles Diogenes had discovered through his own outrageous lifestyle could be adapted and applied by people from every social class and background, creating a philosophical movement unlike anything the world had ever seen. The question was, could a philosophy born from one man's rejection of society actually survive and thrive when it encountered the complex realities of politics, power, and social organization? The answer would transform not just philosophy, but the entire course of Western civilization. Chapter 2. The School of Shamelessness. You're walking through the marketplace of ancient Athens when you witness something that stops you in your tracks. A wealthy, well-dressed man is systematically giving away his entire fortune, gold coins, precious jewellery, even the deed to his family estate, to complete strangers. The crowd thinks he's lost his mind, but this man, Crates of Thebes, has just discovered something he believes is worth more than all the riches in the world, the radical freedom taught by a homeless philosopher living in a clay jar. This is how ideas spread in the ancient world, not through books or lectures, but through the raw power of transformed lives. Diogenes had planted a seed, and now that seed was about to grow into something extraordinary, a philosophical movement that would challenge everything the ancient world believed about success, happiness, and what it means to live a meaningful life. When Diogenes first encountered Crates, the wealthy young man from Thebes was everything the Cynic philosopher despised: pampered, privileged, and preoccupied with social status. Yet something in Diogenes' radical message struck Crates like lightning. Here was a man who had found perfect contentment while owning absolutely nothing, who laughed at the very things that kept Crates awake at night with worry. The transformation wasn't gradual, it was volcanic. Crates didn't just adopt Cynic principles, he threw himself into them with the fervour of a convert. He liquidated his substantial inheritance, estimated at over 200 talents, enough money to live luxuriously for several lifetimes, and distributed every coin to the citizens of Thebes. Then he put on the rough cloak of a Cynic philosopher and walked away from everything he had ever known. But Crates brought something unique to cynicism that even Diogenes hadn't fully developed. He proved that the philosophy could be lived with genuine warmth and humour. Where Diogenes was often harsh and confrontational, Crates embodied what we might call gentle subversion. He would approach wealthy merchants in the agora and, with a knowing smile, ask them to explain why they spent their days accumulating things they would eventually leave behind. His questions weren't accusations, they were invitations to think differently. The ancient sources tell us that people actually enjoyed being challenged by Crates. He had mastered the art of making radical ideas feel accessible, even appealing. Children would run up to him in the streets, and he would teach them philosophy through riddles and games. He showed that rejecting conventional society didn't require rejecting human connection. In fact, it might be the key to deeper, more authentic relationships. And then there was Hipparchia, whose story reveals just how revolutionary cynicism could be. Born into an aristocratic family in Maronea, she was expected to marry well and manage a household like any proper Greek woman. Instead, she fell in love with Crates' philosophy and with Crates himself. When her parents arranged a traditional marriage to a wealthy suitor, Hipparchia shocked everyone by threatening to take her own life unless she could marry the Cynic philosopher instead. Think about what this meant in ancient Greece, where women had virtually no legal rights and rarely appeared in public without male escorts. Hipparchia didn't just choose an unconventional husband, she chose an unconventional life. She wore the same rough cloak as male cynics, engaged in philosophical debates in public spaces, and lived openly with Crates before their marriage. The scandal was enormous. But Hipparchia had found something worth scandalizing society for, the freedom to live according to her own values rather than others' expectations. Together, Crates and Hipparchia became living proof that Cynic principles could create not just individual freedom, but authentic partnership. Ancient writers describe their relationship as remarkably equal and affectionate, revolutionary concepts in a world where marriages were typically economic arrangements. They showed that when you strip away social pretenses and material distractions, What remains can be surprisingly beautiful. But the influence of these early disciples extended far beyond their personal examples. They began to systematize Diogenes' insights, creating what historians call the first truly portable philosophy. Unlike other philosophical schools that required expensive education or access to elite academies, cynicism could be learned by anyone, anywhere. All you needed was the courage to question everything you'd been taught about what makes life worth living. As word spread about these remarkable individuals who had found happiness in the most unlikely places, people throughout the Greek world began to ask themselves a dangerous question. What if everything we've been told about success is wrong? When Roman legions marched into Greece in the 2nd century BCE, they expected to conquer a declining civilization. What they didn't expect was to be conquered themselves, not by Greek armies but by Greek ideas. Among those ideas was cynicism, which found fertile ground in Roman soil for reasons the conquerors never saw coming. Rome was a society built on hierarchy, honor, and the relentless pursuit of glory. Romans measured their worth through military victories, political offices, and elaborate displays of wealth. Yet beneath this confident exterior lay a deep anxiety that Romans rarely acknowledged. The constant fear of losing status, the exhausting effort required to maintain appearances, and the nagging suspicion that all their achievements might ultimately be meaningless. Into this context stepped philosophers like Demetrius, a Syrian cynic, who would become one of the most influential figures in 1st century Rome. Unlike the Greeks who had originated the philosophy, Demetrius understood something crucial about Roman psychology. Romans respected strength above all else, and there was no strength more impressive than the ability to walk away from everything Romans desperately wanted. Demetrius lived this paradox masterfully. He owned nothing but his cloak and staff, yet he commanded the attention of emperors. He had no official position in the government, yet senators sought his counsel on matters of state. He followed no one's orders, yet people lined up to hear his teachings. In a society obsessed with power, he had discovered the ultimate power, complete independence from the system everyone else was trapped within. The relationship between Demetrius and Emperor Vespasian illustrates how cynicism adapted to Roman realities without compromising its core principles. Vespasian, a practical man who had fought his way to the throne through civil war, initially viewed philosophers with suspicion. But something about Demetrius intrigued him. Perhaps it was the cynic's complete fearlessness in the presence of absolute power. Ancient historians record conversations between them that reveal the strange dynamic that developed. Vespasian would test Demetrius by offering him rewards, money, land, official positions, and the philosopher would decline them all with genuine indifference. This wasn't mere stubbornness. Demetrius had trained himself to find these offers literally meaningless. To a Roman emperor accustomed to buying loyalty and compliance, this was both incomprehensible and oddly attractive. When Vespasian asked Demetrius why he lived in such poverty when he could have anything he wanted, the philosopher's response became legendary throughout the empire. "You surround yourself with gold and marble because you fear people won't respect you without them. I own nothing because I know they will respect me regardless. Which of us is truly free?" This exchange reveals how cynicism evolved as it encountered Roman culture. The Greeks had developed the philosophy as a response to the decadence and corruption of their city-states. But Romans faced a different challenge. They had built the most powerful civilization in human history, yet they lived in constant anxiety about maintaining that power. Cynicism offered them something their military conquests and architectural marvels could not: peace of mind. The appeal wasn't limited to intellectuals or outsiders. Some of Rome's most successful citizens found themselves drawn to Cynic teachings, not because they wanted to abandon their achievements, but because they wanted to enjoy them without being enslaved by them. They learned to hold their wealth and status lightly as temporary loans rather than permanent possessions. This Roman adaptation of cynicism created something unprecedented in the ancient world, a philosophy that could thrive within the power structure while maintaining its critical distance from it. Cynics learned to work with emperors and senators while never forgetting that all earthly authority was ultimately temporary and often absurd. But this collaboration with power would soon raise uncomfortable questions that would test the very foundations of Cynic philosophy. Can you truly remain free while advising those who hold others in bondage? Can you maintain your independence while participating in systems of domination? These tensions were about to reveal a fundamental paradox at the heart of the Cynic movement. Here's where the story of cynicism becomes truly fascinating, because it exposes a contradiction that goes to the heart of human nature itself. The Cynics claimed to reject society, yet society couldn't seem to live without them. They positioned themselves as outsiders, yet they became some of the most influential people in the ancient world. They preached independence from social institutions, yet those very institutions began to depend on their wisdom and criticism. This wasn't an accident. It was the natural result of what we might call the Cynic paradox. By removing themselves from the game of social competition, the Cynics gained something incredibly valuable: credibility. When someone has nothing to gain or lose from their advice, people tend to listen more carefully. When someone can't be bought, bribed, or flattered, their words carry a weight that no amount of official authority can provide. Ancient Romans understood this instinctively. They had seen too many advisors who told emperors what they wanted to hear, too many senators who changed their opinions based on political convenience, too many philosophers who adjusted their teachings to please wealthy patrons. But here were people who literally couldn't be corrupted because they had removed everything that corruption typically targets: wealth, status, comfort, and social approval. The result was extraordinary. Cynics became what we might call licensed rebels, people whose job it was to tell uncomfortable truths precisely because they stood outside the system. Roman emperors, who could execute anyone who displeased them, would sit patiently while Cynic philosophers explained exactly why their policies were foolish or their lifestyles were shallow. The emperors not only tolerated this criticism, they actively sought it out. But this special status created a profound dilemma that the Cynics themselves recognized. If society needs rebels, and rebels become socially useful, are they still truly rebelling? If your rejection of the system becomes a service to the system, have you actually escaped it, or have you simply found a more sophisticated way to be trapped by it? Some Cynics resolved this paradox by pushing their outsider status to extremes. They would deliberately shock and offend even their admirers, ensuring that they could never become too comfortable or accepted. They understood that the moment society fully embraces its critics, those critics have probably stopped being truly critical. Others took a different approach, arguing that influence was simply another tool that could be used wisely or foolishly. If you could use your position as a respected outsider to actually improve people's lives or challenge genuinely harmful practices, wasn't that a form of service consistent with Cynic values? After all, Diogenes himself had engaged with Alexander the Great and other powerful figures, not to gain their approval, but to demonstrate alternative ways of thinking and living. This tension reveals something profound about the nature of social change itself. Every successful reform movement faces the same dilemma. How do you change a system from the outside without eventually being absorbed by it? How do you maintain your critical perspective while gaining enough influence to make a real difference? The Cynics never fully resolved this paradox, and perhaps that's exactly why their philosophy remained vital for so many centuries. They understood that the moment you think you've found the perfect balance between engagement and independence, you've probably lost both. The tension itself was the point. It kept them honest, kept them questioning, kept them from becoming another comfortable institution dispensing comfortable wisdom. Plus, 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 plus. But this very success would soon face its greatest test. As the Roman Empire began its long transformation into a Christian civilization, the Cynics would encounter a challenge unlike any they had faced before. A competing vision of radical simplicity and moral purity that claimed not just philosophical insight, but divine authority. The question would no longer be whether society needed its critics, but whether those critics could survive the rise of a new kind of absolute truth. And that confrontation would change not just the fate of cynicism, but the very meaning of the word itself, in ways that would echo through the next 2,000 years of human history. The stage was set for a transformation so complete that the original Cynics would barely recognize what their philosophy would become. As the sun began to set on the classical world, the Cynics had achieved something remarkable. They had proven that a philosophy born in the streets could influence palaces, that ideas developed by society's rejects could become essential to society's functioning. They had created a tradition of principled dissent that would inspire rebels and reformers for generations to come. But ideas, like empires, are fragile things. They can be conquered not just by opposing armies, but by subtle changes in language, meaning, and cultural context. The Cynics were about to discover that their greatest enemy wouldn't be the political authorities they had learned to navigate so skillfully, but something far more insidious: the gradual distortion of their core message by people who claimed to be their allies. What happened next would transform cynicism from a philosophy of courageous truth-telling into something its founders would have found deeply disturbing, a synonym for hopeless bitterness and corrosive distrust. The story of how this happened reveals not just the fate of one philosophical movement, but the fragile nature of meaning itself in human culture. Chapter 3. The Great Distortion. You're playing a game of telephone with 2,000 years of human history. The original message? A radical philosophy of freedom that challenged everything society held sacred. The final message? A bitter worldview that sees only the worst in human nature. This is exactly what happened to cynicism, and the story of how it got twisted beyond recognition reveals something profound about how ideas survive, evolve, and sometimes lose their souls entirely. We've seen how Diogenes and his followers turned homelessness into philosophy and shamelessness into wisdom. But as the ancient world began to crumble and new powers rose to take its place, cynicism was about to face the greatest test any philosophy can endure, being misunderstood by those who came after. The collision between cynicism and Christianity wasn't inevitable, but it was explosive. At first glance, you might think these two movements would be natural allies. After all, both preached the virtues of poverty, both criticized the wealthy and powerful, and both called for a simpler, more authentic way of life. Jesus himself lived much like a cynic philosopher, homeless, possessionless, surrounded by outcasts, speaking truth to power with fearless directness. In fact, some early Christian writers recognized these similarities. They saw in the Cynics a kind of pagan preparation for the gospel, philosophers who had stumbled toward Christian truths through reason alone. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. These similarities weren't seen as strengths for long. Instead, they became threats to Christianity's claim of unique revelation. The problem wasn't just theological, it was practical. If philosophers like Diogenes could achieve wisdom and virtue without divine revelation, what made Christian teaching special? If cynics could live holy lives through their own effort, why did humanity need salvation? Church fathers like Jerome writing in the 4th century, began to see cynicism not as a stepping stone to truth, but as a dangerous counterfeit that might lead souls astray. Jerome's writings reveal this transformation in real time. He describes meeting Cynic philosophers in his travels, initially impressed by their dedication to simplicity and moral purity. But gradually his tone shifts. He begins to emphasize not their virtues, but their pride, their belief that human beings could achieve perfection without God's grace. What had once looked like humility now appeared as the ultimate arrogance, the claim that a person could save themselves. The theological stakes were enormous, but the human cost was equally significant. As Christianity became the dominant force in Western culture, alternative ways of understanding virtue and freedom were systematically marginalized. The Cynic tradition, which had thrived for centuries by questioning authority and challenging conventional wisdom, found itself face to face with an authority that claimed to speak for God himself. But Christianity's challenge to cynicism went deeper than mere competition between worldviews. It struck at the heart of what made cynicism revolutionary, its radical individualism. Where Cynics taught that each person must find their own path to wisdom, Christianity proclaimed one path for all humanity. Where Cynics celebrated the outsider who questioned everything, Christianity demanded submission to divine authority. The very qualities that made cynicism powerful, its skepticism, its independence, its refusal to accept easy answers, were reframed as spiritual dangers. This wasn't simply a matter of different ideas competing in the marketplace of thought. When Christianity gained political power through figures like Emperor Constantine, the stakes became existential. Cynic philosophers found themselves not just argued against, but actively persecuted. Their schools were closed, their books burned, their teachings branded as heretical. The transformation of cynicism from philosophy to slur was beginning, and it would be written in the ashes of the ancient world. Imagine trying to understand jazz by listening only to someone who hated it describe what they remembered from a concert they'd attended decades earlier. This is essentially what happened to cynicism during the medieval period. It survived only through the hostile testimony of its enemies, like a defendant whose case is heard only through the prosecutor's accusations. As the Roman Empire collapsed and Europe entered what we call the Middle Ages, something catastrophic happened to the transmission of classical knowledge. The great libraries of Alexandria and Constantinople were destroyed or neglected. The philosophical schools that had preserved Cynic teachings for 8 centuries simply vanished. Monasteries, the new centres of learning, had little interest in preserving the works of philosophers who preached that organised religion was a form of social control. The result was what we might call intellectual vandalism on a civilizational scale. Of the hundreds of works written by Cynic philosophers over 8 centuries, almost nothing survived intact. We lost Diogenes' own writings. Imagine if we had to understand Shakespeare only through the harsh reviews of his harshest critics. We lost the letters of Crates and Hipparchia, which would have given us intimate glimpses into how Cynic principles worked in daily life. We lost the philosophical treatises that explained Cynic logic and ethics in systematic detail. What did survive tells us everything about how the medieval mind understood, or misunderstood, what cynicism represented. Take the writings of Isidore of Seville, one of the most influential scholars of the 7th century. His encyclopedia, which shaped European education for centuries, contains this description of cynics. They are called dogs because they bark against virtue and growl at the truth. Notice what's happened here. The Cynic embrace of the dog label, originally a symbol of natural honesty, has been transformed into something vicious and destructive. Medieval chroniclers repeated stories about Cynic philosophers, but they retold them with a crucial twist. Where ancient sources describe Diogenes challenging Alexander the Great as an example of philosophical courage, medieval writers presented the same story as evidence of dangerous insubordination. Where earlier accounts celebrated Cynic freedom from social conventions, medieval versions emphasized their supposed hatred of human society itself. This wasn't simply misunderstanding, it was active reinterpretation designed to serve medieval Christianity's needs. The medieval worldview depended on hierarchy, authority, and submission to divine will. Cynicism, with its celebration of individual rebellion and its skepticism toward all forms of power, represented everything this worldview feared. So medieval scholars didn't just ignore cynicism, they actively demonized it, creating a version of the philosophy that justified their own social order by showing where radical individualism supposedly led. The transformation was so complete that by the high Middle Ages, cynic had become synonymous with misanthrope, someone who hated humanity rather than someone who loved it enough to tell it uncomfortable truths. The philosophical position that began as an excess of hope in human potential had been rewritten as an excess of despair about human nature. It was one of the most successful character assassinations in intellectual history, and it would echo through centuries to come. Think about what was lost in this transformation. Medieval Europe was undergoing tremendous social upheaval, the rise of feudalism, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, the emergence of complex bureaucratic institutions that often served power more than people. These were exactly the kinds of conditions that had originally given birth to cynicism. A society undergoing rapid change needed philosophers who could question its assumptions and challenge its power structures. Instead, it got a distorted echo of such philosophy, presented as a cautionary tale about the dangers of thinking too freely. Words are living things. They grow, change, and sometimes die, carrying the history of human thought in their evolution. The transformation of cynical from a badge of philosophical honor to a mark of bitter pessimism is one of the most revealing examples of how language can completely reverse the meaning of an idea while keeping its sound intact. To understand how dramatic this change was, we need to trace the word's journey through different languages and cultures. The original Greek kynikos meant simply dog-like. And as we've seen, this was a compliment in the philosophical world. Dogs were models of natural living, loyal, honest, and free from pretense. When Romans adopted the term as cynicus, they maintained this generally positive sense, even as they sometimes found cynic behavior excessive or impractical. But something fascinating happens when we track the word through medieval Latin. Church writers began using cynicus with increasingly negative connotations, not because the word itself had changed, but because their attitude toward what it represented had shifted. A cynicus in medieval Latin wasn't just a philosopher who lived simply. He was someone who rejected the social bonds that held Christian society together, someone who put his own judgment above divine authority. The real transformation occurred as Latin gave way to vernacular languages across Europe. In medieval French, cynique carried overtones of antisocial behaviour. In early English, cynic suggested someone who was not just critical but destructively so. Each linguistic transition moved the word further from its original meaning, like a game of telephone played across centuries. By the Renaissance, when scholars began rediscovering original Greek texts, they found something remarkable. The ancient sources didn't match what cynic had come to mean in their own language. Renaissance humanists faced a choice. They could either restore the word's original meaning or accept the meaning it had acquired through centuries of distortion. Most chose compromise, acknowledging that ancient cynics were different from modern cynics, while accepting that the word itself had been permanently changed. The English language provides a particularly clear example of this evolution. When Thomas Nasher wrote in 1594 about cynical companions, he meant people who were bitter and distrustful, not philosophers seeking wisdom through simplicity. By Shakespeare's time, cynical had become associated with court characters who saw only the worst in human nature. Think of Iago in Othello or Edmund in King Lear. These characters weren't philosophers at all. They were manipulators who used their supposed insight into human weakness to exploit others. The transformation wasn't random. It reflected deeper changes in how Western culture understood the relationship between individual judgment and social order. As European societies became more centralized and hierarchical, the cynic ideal of radical individual freedom came to seem not just impractical but dangerous. The word cynical began to carry the weight of this cultural anxiety about individualism taken too far. What makes this linguistic evolution particularly tragic is how it obscured the very insights that made cynicism valuable. When we call someone cynical today, we typically mean they're pessimistic about human nature or suspicious of others' motives. But original cynicism was actually optimistic about human nature. It believed people could live virtuously if they freed themselves from corrupting social influences. The ancient cynics weren't suspicious of humans. They were suspicious of the artificial systems humans created that prevented them from being their best selves. This semantic shift has had profound consequences for how we think about criticism and social change. Today, when someone points out problems in society or questions the motives of those in power, they're often dismissed as just being cynical, as if skepticism toward authority were merely a personality flaw rather than a potentially valuable perspective. The original cynics would have found this deeply ironic, since their entire philosophy was based on the belief that societies needed people willing to speak uncomfortable truths. The story of how cynical changed its meaning is really the story of how Western culture gradually lost comfort with radical criticism. As institutions became more powerful and complex, the kind of fundamental questioning that cynicism represented became more threatening. It was easier to redefine such questioning as bitterness or misanthropy than to grapple seriously with the challenges it posed. Understanding this linguistic evolution helps us see why recovering the original meaning of cynicism matters so much for our own time. We live in an era when institutional power is again being questioned, when traditional authorities are losing credibility, when many people feel disconnected from authentic ways of living. These are precisely the conditions that originally gave birth to cynic philosophy. But instead of learning from that tradition, we've inherited a distorted version that makes all criticism seem like mere negativity. The word cynical carries within itself the entire history we've been tracing, from ancient rebellion to medieval suspicion to modern dismissal. Every time we use it, we're participating in a conversation that stretches back thousands of years, even if we don't realize it. And perhaps by understanding how that conversation got distorted, we can begin to hear what the original voices were really trying to tell us. The great distortion of cynicism wasn't an accident. It was the result of profound changes in how human societies organized themselves and understood the role of individual conscience in collective life. What began as a philosophy of liberation was systematically reinterpreted as a philosophy of despair, not because the ideas themselves had changed, but because the world around them had transformed beyond recognition. But here's what's remarkable about ideas. They're remarkably resilient. Even when they're buried under centuries of misinterpretation, even when they're twisted beyond recognition, they have a way of resurging when the conditions are right. As Europe emerged from the medieval period and began to rediscover its classical heritage, some curious minds began to wonder, what if we've been wrong about the Cynics all along? What if there was wisdom in that ancient rebellion that we've been too quick to dismiss? The Renaissance was about to give birth to a new age of questioning, and in that atmosphere of intellectual ferment, the ghost of Diogenes was stirring once again. Chapter 4. The Enlightenment Echo. It's 1750, and Voltaire sits in his study, quill in hand, furiously scribbling a letter that will shake the foundations of French society. But the words flowing onto that parchment aren't entirely his own. They echo the voice of a homeless philosopher who died over 2,000 years earlier, a man who lived in a barrel and insulted emperors to their faces. This is the moment when ancient cynicism, buried for centuries under layers of misunderstanding, suddenly burst back into the light of human consciousness. The Renaissance wasn't just about rediscovering art and science, it was about rediscovering dangerous ideas. Ideas so powerful they would ultimately topple kings and reshape the world. And at the heart of this intellectual revolution lay the forgotten wisdom of the Cynics, waiting like buried treasure to be unearthed by minds hungry for truth. The year 1433 marked a turning point that few people noticed at the time. In the dusty scriptorium of a monastery in Florence, a scholar named Poggio Bracciolini made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden among forgotten manuscripts, he found something extraordinary, the complete works of Diogenes Laertius, a 3rd century historian who had preserved the actual words and deeds of the ancient Cynics. Imagine the excitement. For over 1,000 years, Europeans had known Cynics only through hostile Christian accounts that painted them as bitter misanthropes. But here, suddenly, were their own voices, vibrant, challenging, and utterly different from everything people had been told. It was like finding a time capsule that revealed an entirely different civilization. The manuscript revealed Diogenes of Sinope not as a pessimistic hermit, but as a brilliant social critic who used humour and outrageous behaviour to expose hypocrisy. Renaissance humanists devoured these texts with the hunger of people who had been living on intellectual bread and water suddenly discovering a feast. They found in these ancient rebels something they desperately needed: permission to question everything. Michel de Montaigne, the great French essayist, practically vibrated with excitement as he read about Cynic philosophy. Here were thinkers who had looked at the elaborate social conventions of their time and simply said, "No, thank you." Montaigne began to see how artificial many of his own society's rules really were. Why should birth determine worth? Why should wealth equal virtue? The Cynics had asked these same questions 20 centuries earlier, and their answers still cut through pretense like a blade through silk. But the real earthquake came when scholars realized something profound. These ancient philosophers weren't just criticizing society for the sake of being difficult. They were pointing towards something deeper. The idea that human beings possessed natural rights that no king, no church, no social convention could legitimately violate. The Cynics had proclaimed this revolutionary concept when the very notion of individual rights was almost unthinkable. This rediscovery created a paradox that would define the next few centuries. The more Renaissance thinkers learned about ancient cynicism, the more they realized how thoroughly their own world had forgotten the value of authentic human freedom. And once you see the chains that bind you, it becomes very difficult to pretend they don't exist. The cynic ideas that emerged from those dusty manuscripts didn't march boldly into Enlightenment thought wearing their ancient Greek robes. Instead, they infiltrated like skilled spies, adopting new identities and speaking in contemporary accents while carrying their revolutionary message intact. Consider Jean-Jacques Rousseau, perhaps the most influential political philosopher of the 18th century. When he wrote his famous line, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains," he was channeling pure cynic philosophy. But Rousseau understood something the ancient cynics had discovered through bitter experience. If you're going to challenge everything society holds sacred, you'd better be clever about how you do it. Rousseau's discourse on inequality reads like a love letter to cynic principles, but written in the polite language of academic philosophy. He argued that civilization had corrupted natural human goodness, exactly what Diogenes had claimed when he chose to live like a dog rather than a corrupted citizen. Rousseau even echoed the cynic fascination with animals as moral teachers, arguing that humans in their natural state were happier and more virtuous than their civilized descendants. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. Rousseau was doing something the ancient cynics had rarely attempted. While Diogenes had simply opted out of corrupt society, Rousseau was trying to imagine how society itself could be reformed. He was taking cynic insights about natural human freedom and asking, what if we could build a civilization that actually honored that freedom instead of destroying it? Voltaire took a different approach, but his debt to cynicism was equally profound. Like Diogenes with his lamp, searching for an honest man in broad daylight, Voltaire used wit and satire to expose the absurdities of his age. His Candide reads like a cynic philosophical treatise disguised as an adventure story, systematically demolishing every comfortable assumption about human progress and social order. The underground nature of this influence was partly necessity and partly strategy. Direct attacks on religious and political authority could get you imprisoned or worse. But philosophy dressed as literature, criticism disguised as satire, revolutionary ideas presented as historical observation, these could slip past the censors and plant seeds in minds across Europe. Even more subtle was how cynic ideas about individual autonomy began to reshape economic thinking. When Adam Smith wrote about the invisible hand of the market, he was building on cynic insights about the superiority of natural order over artificial social engineering. The cynics had long argued that people following their genuine nature would create more harmony than any system imposed from above. This philosophical underground was preparing the ground for something unprecedented in human history. The idea that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed, not from divine right or inherited privilege. The cynics had always insisted that no one had the right to rule over another human being simply by virtue of birth or wealth. Now, centuries later, their descendants were beginning to imagine what that might look like in practice. The summer of 1776 brought more than just sweltering heat to Philadelphia. In a modest room in the Pennsylvania State House, a young lawyer named Thomas Jefferson was wrestling with ideas that would transform the world. As he struggled to find the right words for what would become the Declaration of Independence, he was drawing from a philosophical tradition that stretched back to a homeless Greek who had lived in a barrel. Jefferson's famous phrase about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness wasn't just elegant rhetoric, it was pure cynic philosophy translated into political action. The Cynics had always maintained that true happiness came from living according to one's nature, rather than society's expectations, and that this natural freedom was every human being's birthright. Now, for the first time in history, an entire nation was being founded on these principles. But the American Revolution was just the beginning. The real test of Cynic-inspired thinking came 13 years later, when the French people decided they'd had enough of kings and nobles. The parallels between ancient cynicism and revolutionary France are almost uncanny. Just as Diogenes had shocked Athens by treating a powerful emperor as just another human being, the French revolutionaries declared that all men were created equal, a statement that would have made any ancient cynic smile with recognition. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen reads like a political manifesto written by someone who had deeply absorbed Cynic teachings. Its assertion that men are born and remain free and equal in rights echoes the Cynic rejection of artificial social hierarchies. Its emphasis on natural law over human convention reflects the Cynic belief that what matters is not what society says is right, but what human nature itself demands. Consider the revolutionary slogan, "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity." Each word represents a core Cynic value. Liberty meant freedom from artificial social constraints, exactly what Diogenes had achieved by rejecting conventional life. Equality reflected the Cynic insistence that virtue, not birth or wealth, determined human worth. Fraternity captured the Cynic vision of genuine human community based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical domination. The revolutionaries even adopted Cynic methods of social criticism. Just as the ancient Cynics had used shocking behavior to force people to question their assumptions, the French revolutionaries deliberately overturned every symbol of the old order. They renamed the months, redesigned the calendar, and turned Notre Dame Cathedral into a temple of reason. Like the Cynics, they understood that sometimes you have to shock people out of their comfortable assumptions before they can see the truth. But perhaps the most profound way that Cynic philosophy influenced these revolutions was in their attitude toward authority itself. The ancient Cynics had been among the first people in human history to seriously question whether anyone had the right to rule over anyone else. They had asked, by what authority does one human being command another? By what right does birth or wealth grant power over fellow human beings? These questions, which had seemed purely theoretical when asked by ancient philosophers, suddenly became intensely practical when asked by American colonists facing British taxation or French peasants facing aristocratic privilege. The answer in both cases was the same as it had been for the Cynics. No one has the right to rule over others without their consent, and all legitimate authority must ultimately rest on the recognition of natural human equality. The age of revolution proved that ancient Cynic insights weren't just interesting philosophical curiosities, they were practical tools for reshaping human society. The homeless philosopher who had lived in a barrel and insulted Alexander the Great had planted seeds that would eventually grow into the American Bill of Rights and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. Yet as these revolutionary movements spread across the Atlantic world, their leaders faced a challenge the ancient Cynics had never fully addressed. How do you build stable institutions based on principles of natural freedom and equality? How do you create governments that protect liberty without destroying it? The Cynics had shown how to tear down false authority, but the question of what to build in its place would define the next chapter of human political development. The echoes of ancient cynicism had helped spark the greatest political transformations in human history. From the streets of Philadelphia to the salons of Paris, Cynic ideas about natural freedom and human equality had found their moment. But as the smoke cleared from these revolutionary upheavals, a new challenge emerged. The modern world that was being born would need to grapple with forces the ancient cynics had never imagined: industrial capitalism, mass democracy, and total war. And in that struggle, the meaning of cynicism itself was about to undergo another profound transformation, one that would lead us even further from its original wisdom. Chapter 5. The Modern Misunderstanding. Picture this. It's 1919, and the war to end all wars has just concluded. Millions are dead, entire cities lie in ruins. And in the cafes of Paris and London, a new kind of conversation emerges, one laced with bitter laughter and the assumption that all noble ideals are merely masks for selfish motives. This wasn't the philosophical cynicism of Diogenes, who rejected society to find authentic freedom. This was something entirely different, a cynicism born of trauma, disillusionment, and the terrifying realization that civilization itself might be nothing more than a beautiful lie. What happened between ancient Greece and the 20th century wasn't just a change in definition. It was a fundamental transformation of the human spirit. The fearless rebels, who once challenged society to live more authentically, had been replaced by weary observers who no longer believed authentic living was possible. This is the story of how hope transformed into hopelessness and how a philosophy of liberation became a prison of despair. To understand how cynicism lost its soul, we must first understand the century that broke it. The 20th century didn't just witness unprecedented technological progress. It witnessed unprecedented human cruelty on an industrial scale. Think of it this way. Imagine you're living in 1900, filled with optimism about human progress, science and civilization's inevitable march toward enlightenment. Then, in the span of 50 years, you witnessed 2 world wars, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, the invention of weapons capable of destroying all life on Earth, and the emergence of totalitarian regimes that turned human manipulation into an art form. The original cynics, like Diogenes, believed that beneath society's corrupting influence, humans were fundamentally good. They rejected social conventions because they trusted in a more authentic way of being. But the events of the 20th century seem to suggest something far more disturbing. Perhaps the corruption wasn't just in society's institutions, but in human nature itself. Consider the psychological impact of the First World War alone. An entire generation of young men marched off to battle with romantic notions of honour and glory, only to find themselves trapped in muddy trenches, breathing poison gas and witnessing their friends torn apart by machine guns. The poet Wilfred Owen captured this transformation perfectly when he called the old Latin phrase dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. The old lie. This wasn't the cynicism of Diogenes, who rejected false values to embrace true ones. This was the cynicism of men who had stopped believing that true values existed at all. The Holocaust added another devastating layer to this disillusionment. Here was evidence that educated, civilized people, doctors, teachers, engineers, could systematically participate in unimaginable evil. The comfortable belief that education and culture naturally led to moral progress crumbled in the face of such organized brutality. If civilization could produce Auschwitz, what did that say about the very foundations of human society? The Cold War that followed brought its own unique form of cynicism. This wasn't the dramatic brutality of open warfare, but the slow poison of constant suspicion. In a world where neighbours might be spies, where governments lied as a matter of routine, and where the threat of nuclear annihilation hung over every political decision, trust itself became a luxury few could afford. The paranoia that characterized this era wasn't just about foreign enemies, it was about the reliability of truth itself. But here's what made this transformation so profound. These weren't abstract philosophical problems. These were lived experiences that touched virtually every family in the developed world. Unlike the ancient cynics who chose their rejection of society as a path to freedom, 20th century cynicism felt like a survival mechanism. In a world where idealism had repeatedly led to catastrophe, cynicism seemed like the only rational response. Yet this shift came with a terrible cost. Where ancient cynics rejected false values in order to embrace authentic ones, modern cynics began rejecting the very possibility of authentic values. The question was no longer, how can we live authentically, but rather, is authentic living even possible? This fundamental shift would reshape not just philosophy, but the entire cultural landscape of the modern world. While the traumas of the 20th century created the emotional conditions for modern cynicism, it took specific intellectual figures to articulate this new worldview and make it culturally respectable. The transformation of cynicism from a philosophy of liberation to an attitude of sophisticated resignation didn't happen by accident. It was actively constructed by writers, critics and thinkers who elevated bitter skepticism to the status of wisdom. Consider H.L. Mencken, perhaps the most influential cynic of the early 20th century. Mencken wasn't a homeless philosopher living in a barrel like Diogenes. He was a successful journalist and critic who wielded cynicism like a surgical instrument, dissecting American culture with gleeful precision. But notice the crucial difference. Where Diogenes used outrageous behaviour to shock people into questioning their assumptions, Mencken used wit and intelligence to confirm people's worst suspicions about human nature. Mencken's famous definition of democracy as the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard reveals this new, cynical worldview perfectly. This wasn't a call to reject democracy in favour of something more authentic. It was a sophisticated way of saying that all political systems are equally corrupt, so we might as well laugh at the absurdity. Mencken's cynicism didn't challenge people to live differently. It gave them permission to feel superior while changing nothing. This represents a fundamental philosophical shift that we need to understand clearly. Ancient cynics were activists. Their rejection of social conventions was meant to inspire others to examine their own lives. Modern cynics became spectators. Their rejection of social conventions became a way of avoiding engagement altogether. The cynic was no longer someone who lived differently, but someone who thought differently while living exactly like everyone else. The post-war intellectual climate provided fertile ground for this new form of cynicism. Thinkers like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer developed the concept of the culture industry, arguing that modern entertainment and media were tools of social control that manipulated people into passive consumption. While their analysis contained important insights, it also fostered a cynical worldview where authentic experience became virtually impossible. If everything was manipulation, then resistance itself might be just another form of manipulation. Film noir emerged during this same period as the artistic embodiment of modern cynicism. Unlike the ancient cynics who believed in the possibility of moral clarity, noir presented a world where everyone had hidden motives, where love was always tainted by betrayal, and where the search for truth only revealed deeper layers of corruption. The hard-boiled detective became the perfect modern cynic, world-weary, suspicious and convinced that everyone was hiding something. What made this new cynicism so seductive was its intellectual sophistication. It felt smart to assume that politicians were lying, that businesses were exploiting customers, and that noble causes were really about power and money. This wasn't the naive idealism that had led to the disasters of the 20th century. This was clear-eyed realism about human nature. The problem was that this realism gradually became a prison of its own, a worldview where positive change became impossible because all motives were suspect. The transformation was now complete. Cynicism had evolved from a philosophy that said, reject false values to find true ones, to an attitude that said, all values are false, so don't bother looking. The ancient cynic's lamp, once used to search for honest people, had been extinguished. The modern cynic no longer bothered to search because he was convinced that honest people didn't exist. This wasn't wisdom, it was wisdom's shadow, a sophisticated form of despair dressed up as intelligence. By the latter half of the 20th century, something remarkable had happened. Cynicism had become so pervasive that it was no longer a conscious philosophical choice, but simply the default way of interpreting reality. What had once been a radical position, the assumption that all public figures are corrupt, all institutions are self-serving, and all idealistic rhetoric masks selfish motives, had become the basic operating system of modern culture. This transformation is perhaps most visible in how we consume media and entertainment. Consider how political coverage evolved from the respectful reporting of the 1950s to the aggressive skepticism that defines contemporary journalism. Reporters no longer simply report what politicians say, they automatically search for the real motivation behind every statement. While this skepticism can serve important democratic functions, it has also created a media environment where sincerity itself has become almost impossible to communicate. Any expression of genuine idealism is immediately subjected to analysis designed to reveal its true cynical motives. The entertainment industry both reflected and amplified this cynical worldview. Television shows like The Sopranos and House of Cards didn't just portray corrupt characters, they made cynicism itself entertaining and even attractive. The anti-hero became more compelling than the traditional hero because cynical characters felt more realistic to audiences who had been trained to distrust noble motivations. We reached a cultural moment where goodness seemed naive and corruption seemed sophisticated. Social media has accelerated this process in ways that would have shocked even mid-century cynics. Platforms designed to connect people have instead created environments where cynical interpretations spread faster than charitable ones. The very structure of these platforms, their emphasis on brief, attention-grabbing content, favours cynical takes over nuanced analysis. A cynical tweet about a politician's motivations will get more engagement than a thoughtful examination of policy implications. The ancient cynic's search for authentic human connection has been replaced by a digital marketplace where cynicism is literally profitable. Perhaps most troubling is how this cynical worldview has shaped expectations about personal relationships and individual behaviour. Young people growing up in this environment often assume that everyone is primarily motivated by self-interest, that romantic love is temporary at best, and that friendship always involves hidden calculations. The ancient cynics rejected social conventions to find authentic relationships. But modern cynicism makes authentic relationships seem impossible from the start. This cultural shift has created what we might call defensive cynicism, a preemptive assumption of the worst about others as a way of protecting oneself from disappointment. Unlike the ancient cynics, who took personal risks in pursuit of authentic living, defensive cynics avoid risk altogether by assuming that authentic living is impossible. The philosophy that once demanded courage now provides an excuse for cowardice. The psychological cost of this transformation cannot be overstated. When cynicism becomes a cultural default, it creates a society of people who are simultaneously over-informed about corruption and underprepared for genuine goodness. We become experts at detecting manipulation, but amateurs at recognizing sincerity. We develop sophisticated tools for analyzing others' motives, but lose the ability to trust our own. This is perhaps the greatest tragedy of cynicism's modern transformation. The ancient cynics lived with tremendous hope. They believed so strongly in human potential that they were willing to reject everything false in pursuit of what was true. Modern cynicism has inverted this completely, creating a world where rejecting the false is easy, but finding the true seems impossible. We have become a culture of expert critics and inexperienced believers, skilled at tearing down but unskilled at building up. The question that emerges from this cultural analysis is both urgent and challenging. If cynicism has become our default setting, how do we rediscover the courage to hope? If distrust has become a mark of intelligence, how do we learn to recognize trustworthiness when we encounter it? These questions will become crucial as we explore whether ancient wisdom might offer a path beyond modern cynicism's sophisticated despair. As we've seen, the 20th century didn't just change how we define cynicism, it fundamentally altered our relationship with hope itself. The philosophy that once demanded everything from its followers now asks nothing except that we remain safely suspicious of anyone who asks for anything at all. But what if this sophisticated despair isn't the end of the story? What if buried beneath our modern cynicism lies the same human longing for authentic living that drove Diogenes to live in a barrel and search for honest people with his lamp? In our final chapter, we'll discover that reports of cynicism's death may have been greatly exaggerated. Around the world, in ways both small and profound, people are rediscovering what it means to live cynically in the original sense, not as bitter observers of human folly, but as courageous participants in the ancient search for authentic freedom. The lamp that seemed extinguished may simply have been waiting for someone brave enough to light it again. Chapter 6. The Cynic's Return. Picture. This. A woman sits in her BMW at a red light, scrolling through her phone, when a homeless man approaches her window. Most drivers look away, lock their doors, or pretend to be busy. But Sarah Chen rolls down her window and hands him not money, but a business card. "I'm looking for someone brave enough to tell the truth," she says. "Interested in a job?" That homeless man was Marcus Rodriguez, a former Wall Street analyst who lost everything in 2008 and chose to stay on the streets rather than return to what he calls the lie of success. Today, Marcus works for Sarah's consulting firm, helping Fortune 500 companies identify their blind spots by asking the uncomfortable questions no one else dares to ask. They call themselves corporate cynics, and they're part of a quiet revolution happening right under our noses. Welcome to the return of true cynicism. Not the bitter, defeated attitude we've grown accustomed to, but the bold, life-affirming philosophy that Diogenes would recognize instantly. After 24 centuries, the ancient cynics are coming home. Sarah and Marcus aren't anomalies. They're part of a growing movement of people who've discovered what the ancient Greeks knew all along, that living authentically in an inauthentic world requires the courage of a cynic. Meet Dr. Kailash Satyarthi, the Nobel Peace Prize winner who gave up a comfortable engineering career to rescue children from slavery. When critics called him naive for believing he could change a system that profits billions, Satyarthi responded like a true cynic. They called Diogenes crazy too, but he was the sanest man in Athens. Today his organization has freed over 90,000 children and transformed global attitudes toward child labor. Or consider Greta Thunberg, who embodied the cynic tradition when she stood before world leaders and declared, "How dare you?" Like Diogenes mocking Alexander the Great, she stripped away the comfortable lies adults tell themselves about climate change. Her weapon wasn't cynicism in the modern sense, it was the ancient cynic's fearless commitment to truth, no matter how uncomfortable. Then there's Joshua Fields Milburn, who walked away from a six-figure corporate job to live with just 288 possessions. People thought I'd lost my mind, he tells audiences, but I'd actually found it. His minimalist lifestyle echoes the ancient cynic's rejection of material excess, proving that voluntary simplicity isn't about deprivation, it's about discovering what truly matters. These modern cynics share something profound with their ancient predecessors. They've chosen authenticity over approval, meaning over money, and truth over comfort. They understand that real freedom doesn't come from having more choices. It comes from needing fewer things. But here's what's fascinating. Most of them had never heard of Diogenes when they made their life-changing decisions. They discovered cynic principles independently, suggesting that these truths are hardwired into human nature, waiting to emerge when we're brave enough to listen. These individual awakenings are powerful, but they're just the beginning. Because in our hyper-connected digital age, the ancient cynics' tools of truth-telling have found their most powerful platform yet. Imagine if Diogenes had access to Twitter. The man who carried a lamp through Athens, searching for an honest man, would probably be the most followed and most blocked account on social media. In many ways, he already is. Every time someone uses the internet to expose corruption, challenge conventional wisdom, or refuse to participate in digital performativity, they're channeling the spirit of ancient cynicism. The question is, are we using these tools for liberation or letting them enslave us? Consider Edward Snowden, who gave up everything to reveal how governments spy on their citizens. Like the ancient cynics who lived as outsiders to critique society from within, Snowden chose exile to preserve his ability to speak truth to power. His digital revelations echo Diogenes' public demonstrations. Both use shock and exposure to force society to confront uncomfortable realities. But modern technology presents challenges the ancient cynics never faced. Social media promises connection, but often delivers isolation. Dating apps offer infinite choice, but make commitment nearly impossible. Consumer platforms provide convenience while quietly harvesting our attention and autonomy. The modern cynic faces a paradox. How do you live authentically in a world designed to manipulate your desires? How do you maintain simplicity when algorithms constantly create new needs? How do you practice honesty in spaces built on performativity and illusion? Some have found ingenious solutions. Digital minimalists like Cal Newport advocate for digital decluttering, essentially applying cynic principles to technology use. They ask, does this technology serve my values or do I serve it? The answer determines what stays and what goes. Others, like artist and activist Molly Fisher, use social media platforms against themselves. Her project, Authentic Selfies, shows people in genuinely vulnerable moments, crying, exhausted, confused, instead of the curated perfection we've come to expect. If Diogenes lived today, she says, he'd probably post his worst photos just to remind us that being human isn't always pretty. The most successful digital cynics seem to follow an ancient principle. They use technology without being used by it. They engage with digital platforms while maintaining what researchers call technological sovereignty, the ability to choose when, how and why they connect. They've learned something crucial that Diogenes understood instinctively. Freedom isn't about rejecting all social structures. It's about refusing to let those structures define your identity or dictate your values. This wisdom becomes even more crucial when we realize that the choice between authentic and inauthentic living isn't just personal, it's the defining challenge of our time. Every morning, Maria Santos faces the same decision that confronted Diogenes 2,400 years ago. Will she live according to her values or according to other people's expectations? Maria is a software engineer in Silicon Valley, ground zero for the modern obsession with optimization, productivity, and infinite growth. 3 years ago, she was working 80-hour weeks, earning $200,000 a year, and slowly dying inside. I had everything I was supposed to want, she recalls, and I was miserable. The turning point came when she read about Diogenes online. Here was this guy who had nothing but was completely free, she remembers. I had everything and felt completely trapped. Maria made a radical choice. She quit her job, moved to a smaller apartment, and started freelancing part-time while dedicating the rest of her energy to teaching coding to underprivileged kids. Her family thought she'd lost her mind. Her former colleagues predicted financial ruin. But Maria discovered what the ancient cynics knew, that voluntary simplicity isn't about having less, it's about needing less. She traded external validation for internal peace, material accumulation for meaningful contribution. I make a third of what I used to earn, she says, but I'm 3 times happier. I finally understand what Diogenes meant about being rich. It's not about having a lot of money, it's about not needing a lot of money. Maria's story illustrates a profound shift happening across cultures and generations. People are recognizing that the relentless pursuit of more stuff, more status, more stimulation, often leads to less satisfaction, less meaning, less authentic connection. Researchers call this voluntary downshifting, but it's actually an ancient practice. The cynics understood that external desires are infinite while human needs are finite. Satisfy your needs, they taught, and ignore your manufactured wants. This isn't about deprivation, it's about discrimination. Learning to distinguish between what you need and what you've been told you need. The modern cynic faces unique challenges, though. In Diogenes' time, social pressure came from your immediate community, maybe a few hundred people. Today we carry the expectations of thousands in our pockets. Social media creates what psychologists call compare and despair. We measure our insides against everyone else's outsides, forgetting that most online personas are carefully curated performances. But this same connectivity offers unprecedented opportunities for authentic living. Never before have so many people had access to philosophical wisdom, alternative lifestyle examples, and communities of like-minded individuals seeking genuine connection over superficial networking. The choice is starker now than ever. We can use these tools to become more authentically ourselves, or we can let them turn us into products optimized for someone else's profit. We can practice ancient cynic principles of simplicity and honesty, or we can participate in what researcher Sherry Turkle calls life mix, the blending of online and offline identities until we lose track of who we really are. The ancient cynics offer a third option: conscious non-participation in systems that diminish our humanity. Not bitter withdrawal, but strategic disengagement. Not pessimistic retreat, but optimistic refusal to accept that things must stay as they are. This brings us to the heart of why rediscovering authentic cynicism matters so much right now, because the stakes have never been higher. Here's the remarkable thing about Sarah Chen, Marcus Rodriguez, Maria Santos, and millions of others quietly choosing authentic over artificial living. They're not trying to return to the past. They're using ancient wisdom to create a genuinely new future. The original cynics understood something we're only beginning to rediscover: that personal freedom and social responsibility aren't opposites. They're two sides of the same coin. The more authentically we live, the more we inspire others to question their own compromises. The more we refuse to participate in dehumanizing systems, the more space we create for human alternatives. This isn't about everyone becoming homeless philosophers carrying lamps through city streets. It's about each of us asking the questions Diogenes asked. What do I actually need to be happy? What would I do if I weren't afraid of what others think? How would I live if I only had to answer to my own conscience? The answers might surprise you. They might change everything. Because here's what the ancient cynics discovered and what modern neuroscience confirms. Authentic living isn't just personally liberating, it's contagious. When we stop performing happiness and start experiencing it, we give others permission to do the same. When we choose meaning over money, we make it easier for others to make similar choices. When we practice what researchers call radical honesty, speaking truth even when it's inconvenient, we create space for others to drop their masks too. The cynical worldview that dominates our culture today tells us that humans are fundamentally selfish, that authentic change is impossible, that idealism is naive. But the ancient cynics prove otherwise. They show us that human nature includes an irrepressible urge toward freedom, truth, and authentic connection. These impulses don't disappear, they just go underground, waiting for the right moment to emerge. That moment might be now. Because while we've been told that cynicism means giving up hope, the original cynics show us something different, that hope requires the courage to live as if change is possible, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. They chose to live like free people in an unfree world, like honest people in a dishonest system, like hopeful people in a hope-starved culture. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Not because it guaranteed success, but because it guaranteed authenticity. The question isn't whether we can afford to be cynical in the ancient sense. The question is whether we can afford not to be. Because in a world of increasing artificiality, someone has to remember what authentic living looks like. In a culture of manufactured desires, someone has to model genuine contentment. In a time of comfortable lies, someone has to tell uncomfortable truths. That someone could be you. The only question is, are you brave enough to carry the lamp? Conclusion. So here we are. We started this journey in the streets of ancient Athens with a crazy old man living in a barrel. We're ending it right here, right now with you. And that's not an accident, because the story of cynicism isn't really about ancient Greeks or medieval monks or modern philosophers. It's about the choice you make when you wake up tomorrow morning. Remember that first scene? The busy city street, everyone rushing past with their phones, consumed by the endless chase for more, better, faster. Look around you right now. Really look. How many people do you see who seem genuinely happy? Not performed for social media happy. Not keeping up appearances happy, but that deep, quiet contentment that Diogenes carried everywhere he went? Not many, right? Here's why. We've been living the opposite of the Cynic philosophy for so long, we've forgotten what the original even looked like. We chase things we don't actually want. We perform emotions we don't actually feel. We fear losing stuff that never made us happy in the first place. And then we wonder why we feel so empty. But what if I told you that every single day you have the opportunity to make the same choice Diogenes made? Not the barrel, not the homelessness, but the freedom. The freedom to say no to things that don't serve your soul. The freedom to be honest when everyone else is performing. The freedom to choose meaning over money, authenticity over approval, truth over comfort. What if I told you that cynicism, real cynicism, isn't something you learn from books or documentaries? It's something you practice every single day. Tomorrow morning, when your alarm goes off, you'll face your first cynic choice. Will you immediately grab your phone and start consuming other people's lives? Or will you take a moment to check in with your own? When you get dressed, will you choose clothes that express who you are, or clothes designed to impress people you don't even like? When someone asks how you're doing, will you give the automatic fine response, or will you risk a moment of real human connection? These seem like tiny choices, insignificant moments, but Diogenes understood something we've forgotten. Freedom isn't won in grand gestures. It's won in small daily acts of authenticity. See, we've spent this entire documentary talking about the difference between ancient cynicism and modern cynicism. But there's a third kind we haven't discussed. Future cynicism. The cynicism of people who understand that the world doesn't have to stay the way it is, who believe that humans are capable of more than what our current culture demands, who live as if change is possible even when the evidence suggests otherwise. That's you, right now, if you choose it. Because here's what nobody talks about. You're going to die. I'm going to die. Everyone you love is going to die. Everyone you hate is going to die. And when that happens, the only thing that will matter is whether you spent your brief time here being yourself or being what other people expected you to be. Diogenes understood this with crystal clarity. That's why he could mock Alexander the Great without fear. That's why he could throw away his possessions without regret. That's why he could live in a barrel without shame. He knew something most people never figure out. You can't lose what you never really needed, and you can't be truly hurt by people whose opinions don't actually matter. So what would happen if you started living like that? What would happen if you stopped trying to impress people and started trying to express yourself? What would happen if you stopped accumulating stuff and started accumulating experiences? What would happen if you stopped performing happiness and started pursuing it? What would happen if you became cynical in the ancient sense, fearlessly optimistic about human potential, including your own? Here's the beautiful secret the ancient cynics discovered. Authenticity is contagious. When you start living genuinely, you give other people permission to drop their masks too. When you choose substance over style, you make it easier for others to make the same choice. When you refuse to participate in the endless performance of modern life, you create space for real human connection. You become what researchers call a cultural creative, someone who shows others that different ways of living are possible. You become living proof that cynicism doesn't have to mean giving up hope. It can mean refusing to give up hope, even when hope seems impossible. So here's your challenge, your invitation, your opportunity. For the next week, try living like a cynic, not the bitter, defeated kind, the original kind. Ask yourself, What do I actually need to be happy? What would I do if I weren't afraid of what others think? How would I live if I only had to answer to my own conscience? Then, and this is the crucial part, start making choices based on those answers. Start small, start today, start right now. Because here's what Diogenes would tell you if he were here. You already have everything you need to be free, not the freedom to do whatever you want. That's not freedom, that's chaos. But the freedom to be whoever you actually are, underneath all the layers of expectations and performance and fear. The freedom to live authentically in an inauthentic world. The freedom to tell the truth in a culture built on comfortable lies. The freedom to choose hope in an age of manufactured despair. 2,400 years ago, a man named Diogenes carried a lamp through the streets of Athens, claiming to search for an honest person. He never found one. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was to keep carrying the lamp. Maybe the point was to keep believing that honest people exist, even when you can't find them. Maybe the point was to become the person you're looking for. So tell me, are you brave enough to pick up the lamp? Are you ready to stop being cynical about cynicism? Are you willing to discover what happens when you choose authentic over artificial, meaning over money, truth over comfort? The choice is yours. It always has been. Welcome to your cynic life. It starts now. The question was never whether the world needs more cynics. The question is whether you're ready to become one.